In 1948, the State of Israel was proclaimed. Palestine was lost. 16 years later, in 1964, the Palestine Liberation Organization, or the PLO, was founded. Made up of different factions, the PLO has been at the heart of the struggle to regain Palestine ever since. Setting up an independent Palestinian organization was not easy. The first challenge the Palestinians faced was to wrest control of their own destiny from the Arab regimes. In early 1965, a series of attacks were carried out against Israeli civilians and infrastructure. A previously unknown Palestinian group calling itself Al-Asifa, meaning the storm, seen here in training, claimed responsibility for the attacks. Al-Asifa was started by a small group of Palestinian activists in the diaspora. They believed armed struggle was the only way to win back their lost homeland. The Arab regimes did not share this view. They feared being drawn into a conflict with Israel, for which they did not feel prepared. Palestine had been an area of conflict for many years. In 1947, Great Britain announced it was terminating its mandate over Palestine.
I repeat again that His Majesty's government have determined to base their policy on the assumption that they must lay down the mandate, under which they have sought for 25 years to discharge their obligations to fulfill the growth of the Jewish national home and to protect the interests of the Arab population. In order that there may be no misunderstanding of the attitude and policy of Britain, I have been instructed by His Majesty's government to announce with all solemnity that they have consequently decided that in the absence of a settlement, they must plan for an early withdrawal of British forces and of the British administration from Palestine.
Britain handed over Palestine to the United Nations. In 1947, the UN General Assembly decided to partition Palestine into two states, one Arab, the other Jewish. This partition plan was rejected by Palestinians and neighboring Arab states. In early 1948, open conflict erupted between Jews and Palestinians. In a confidential briefing at the time, America's Central Intelligence Agency predicted a defeat for the Jews.
As the Arabs gradually coordinate their war effort, the Jews will be forced to withdraw from isolated positions, and, having been drawn into a war of attrition, will gradually be defeated.
Following the withdrawal of the last British troops in May 1948, Jewish leaders proclaimed the establishment of the State of Israel. On the very next day, 5 Arab armies from Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq immediately declared war. One young Palestinian activist who was living in Cairo at the time was keen to join the fight.
أنا تركت تعليم كنت أدرس واجتمعنا إحنا الطلاب الفلسطينيين في الشبان المسلمين.
I left school. We gathered at the Young Muslims Association and we decided that whoever wanted to fight would have to burn their books. I was among those who burned their books and went and joined the army of Holy Struggle.
The Arab armies were defeated. The newly declared State of Israel seized control of most of Palestine, with the exception of Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. By 1949, close to 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees. In the late 1950s in Kuwait, amid the popular sentiment of Arab unity common in the region, a group of Palestinian exiles established a secret organization. They called it the Palestinian National Liberation Movement. It became known more popularly as Fatah. Yasser Arafat was one of the ringleaders of this new organization, which favored armed struggle to achieve the liberation of Palestine.
في الكويت سميناها فتح.
It was in Kuwait that we named it Fatah. But before that, it was a continuation of our Palestinian nationalistic activities.
Such activities were aimed at gaining autonomy from the Arab regimes, most dominant of which was the regime of Egyptian President Jamal Abdel Nasser. Rival Palestinian groups emerged, advocating coordination with Nasser's regime.
We took a decision to form a Palestinian branch and coordinated this with President Nasser. It was agreed that our actions would conform with the overall Egyptian military strategy, that we wouldn't carry out military action that would prematurely draw Egypt into a war with Israel, for which it wasn't yet prepared.
In 1964, President Nasser convened the first Arab summit. His aim was to lead an Arab response to the continued existence and growing dominance of Israel. The Arab leaders voted to set up a body to organize the Palestinians in their diaspora. Ahmed al-Shuqairi, seen here on the right, a Palestinian diplomat from a well-known family, was chosen to head the newly formed body. From the outset, Shuqairi wanted an organization which would not just kowtow to Arab regimes.
The Arabs agreed to set up the PLO as a means of releasing the frustrations felt by the Palestinians. But in came Ahmed al-Shuqairi, who decided he was going to form a proper PLO. And he did. He must take the credit for setting up the PLO, its structure and national charter. He was a great man who should be recognized as such.
4 months later, in May of 1964, Shuqairi convened the first Palestinian parliament in Jerusalem. It was called the Palestine National Council. King Hussein of Jordan, the country which had administered the West Bank since 1950, attended the meeting. The parliament consisted of Palestinian elders as well as a younger generation who called for a more forceful approach to winning back their homeland. The parliament formally announced the establishment of the Palestine Liberation Organization and declared the State of Israel as illegal. To guarantee Jordanian acceptance of the meeting, Shuqairi allayed Jordanian fears by announcing that the PLO had no designs on the West Bank and was only interested in regaining territory from Israel. Shuqairi spent the next few years building support for the PLO. He set out to create a body that could truly be considered a voice for the stateless Palestinians. He traveled far and wide in his endeavors. Here, he is seen in China, where he was accorded a welcome usually reserved for visiting heads of state.
أحد الشقيري فلسطيني صحيح كان قريب للناصرية.
Ahmed Shuqairi is a Palestinian first and foremost. True, he was close to Nasser, but he proved more than once that he was a Palestinian first. He didn't take on the job to be a tool of Nasser, but to channel the energies of the Palestinian people. He raised the bar when it came to Nasser's views on Palestinian nationalism.
كان المفروض أن ننطلق في 64.
We were supposed to launch in 1964, before the Palestine National Council meeting in Jerusalem. I was there in Jerusalem, but didn't attend the meeting. I was preparing to launch military operations as a gift to the PNC, but we decided against it because we thought it might be perceived as an attempt to upstage the council meeting and its resolutions.
Arafat and his revolutionary comrades in Fatah viewed the newly created PLO with great suspicion. They felt the organization was the product of the same impotent Arab regimes that had lost Palestine in 1948. The Fatah activists wanted instead to take matters into their own hands. And in January 1965, they began attacking targets in Israel. Although militarily insignificant, the first attack was a sign of things to come.
فتح أعلنت عن أول عملية، وأنا برأيي لم تكن أول دورية نزلت للأرض المحتلة.
Fatah declared it had mounted the first operation, although I don't believe it was the first Palestinian patrol to go into occupied Palestine. But the significance is that Fatah's declaration heralded the independence of Palestinian decision-making, that Palestinians would no longer be subservient to Arab government diktat, which would never have approved the launching of the armed struggle.
Arab leaders greeted Fatah's operations with distrust and disdain. They were wary of a radical Palestinian group acting on its own initiative. President Nasser of Egypt suspected Fatah was an extension of the Muslim Brotherhood with whom he was engaged in a vicious struggle. Palestinians who were allied to Nasser hurled elaborate accusations against their fellow Palestinians in Fatah.
كانت الاتهامات تصل إنه هاي خلقتها CIA.
We charged Fatah with being an anti-Nasser body affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, even a creation of the CIA. There was a real battle going on between Egyptian intelligence and Fatah. So when Fatah launched its first operation and announced the beginning of the armed struggle, the Arab nationalist movement mounted an all-out assault on Fatah and accused it of trying to drag Nasser into war.
Other Arab leaders openly spoke out in favor of negotiation rather than armed struggle. In 1966, Tunisian President Habib Bourguiba arrived in Egypt on a tour of the region. While in the West Bank, he advised his Palestinian audience to seek a negotiated settlement in order to resolve the Palestinian refugee problem. A message he repeated in Lebanon.
في بيروت معروف أن فيها صحافة حرة وكل إنسان ينجم يتكلم.
We traveled to Beirut, which was known for its free press. We heard a lot of illogical things at the press conference held by Bourguiba. Someone said we are prepared to wait 100 years for a solution to the Palestinian issue. To which Bourguiba replied, "You are a journalist and not a Palestinian. Had you been a Palestinian, you would be adamant that a solution be found as soon as possible."
Bourguiba's comments drew a hostile response. The Arab press denounced him as a traitor and a madman. In Cairo, the Tunisian embassy was set alight by angry demonstrators. The Arab leaders seemed to be out of step with the mood on the street. For his part, President Nasser sought to convince the West of the need to address the problem of the Palestinians before it provoked further violence and instability.
About the rights of the Arabs of Palestine who were expelled out of their country. We have about 1.5 million refugees expelled completely. You know, the Israelis speak about the Nazi treatment and how they were badly treated in Germany during the Second World War and before the war and so on. They treated the Arabs the same way, expelled them, killed their children, destroyed their villages, and there was escape from Palestine to the Arab country. I was there on 40. There were the United Nations resolutions, the Security Council resolution. Nothing was fulfilled. And then Israel took everything, took the property of those people, everything, the land, everything from those. What about the rights of those people? You are from Britain. Do you accept to give Manchester to some other people? And if you are American, I ask you, do you accept to give California to some other people? Or do you accept the status quo of occupying Manchester by some other people, by the Chinese, for instance, and then reach agreement after expelling the people of Manchester from their homes, depriving them from their property, from everything? This is the question of Palestine. This question is not represented in Britain or in the West because of the influence of the Jewish propaganda. The Arabs of Palestine want to return back to their homeland, to regain their property. What was the answer of the Israelis? The answer of the Israelis was no. They will not permit single Arab to return back, and they will not give them back their property. But we can do the Arabs. If you have a right and nobody is ready to give it to you, so the only solution is force.
Ask this man, when does he think he'll go back to Palestine?
Nasser's views were echoed by Palestinian refugees who believed liberation was close at hand.
شاء الله السنة هذه في أقرب وقت إن شاء الله يعني خلال الصيف هذا He's hoping to go back to Palestine this very year.
How does he think he's going to do that?
كيف تظن أنك ستعود إلى فلسطين؟ كيف تظن أنك ستعود إلى فلسطين؟ في طريق التحرير. He is going to liberate Palestine.
How is he going to liberate it? Well, with force of arms or how?
كيف يمكنك تحرير فلسطين يا ترى بطريق السلاح؟ بطريق السلاح نعم. Yes, by force of arms.
The revolutionaries of Fatah, led by Yasser Arafat, found refuge and support within Syria, viewed as one of the most hardline regimes in the region at the time. And it was Syria that brought matters to a head in 1967.
سوريا بدأت تصرخ أيام صلاح جديد بأن الإسرائيليين يستعدون.
Syria began to cry wolf, claiming that Israel was about to wage war against it, and the Soviets concurred. So Nasser sent an Egyptian military delegation to the Golan that studied the situation and returned with the view that war was not in the offing. But then the Soviets repeated their claims of a coming war.
With the mantle of leader of the Arab world firmly upon his shoulders, President Nasser found it difficult to step back from the escalating tensions in the region. In May 1967, he requested the withdrawal of United Nations observers from Sinai and closed the Suez Canal to Israeli shipping. To Israel, these moves were tantamount to a declaration of war. With conflict imminent, Arab leaders attempted to close ranks. King Hussein of Jordan, who had been the target of accusations and insults by Egyptian state media, made a hasty reconciliation with Nasser.
Letting bygones be bygones was a means of escaping the insults. Egyptian media perfected personal attacks on His Majesty, but the euphoria of the reconciliation and path to war was soon transformed into weeping, which has continued to this day.
A frenzied Arab world waited for the outbreak of war. As in 1948, expectations of an Arab victory and the destruction of Israel were high. The reality proved very different. In June 1967, in a matter of hours, Israel decimated the Egyptian Air Force. Israeli ground troops seized the Sinai Peninsula, overran Syria's Golan Heights, and occupied East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. The Arab world was shocked and stunned. The Arabs lost what remained of Palestine, and even more Palestinians were forced to flee their homeland. Fatah felt vindicated. The Arab states had yet again proved incapable of defeating Israel. With the Arab regimes in disarray, the path now lay open for the Palestinians to fight for themselves.
كانت مؤثرة جدا، ولكن كانت حافز كبير إنه لابد من التعويض.
The defeat in 1967 was very painful, but at the same time, it was a great incentive for us to work harder and achieve something.
After the war, I used to make my way from the Lebanese border to Syria onto Jordan. I was never questioned. My car was full of weapons. The Arab armies were defeated, broken. We used to go to the Golan to gather weapons left by the retreating Syrians. There was a state of utter destruction, in which the Palestinians, whose cause it was, rose and took action.
Arafat, traveling incognito, made his way into the occupied West Bank in an effort to organize resistance. But the Israelis were close on his heels.
كان عندنا مش أقل من 500-600 فدائي بالضفة الغربية.
We had at least 500 to 600 members in the West Bank. In about 15 days, Israeli Defense Minister Dayan managed to capture about 300 of them, and everything fell apart. I remember Arafat being in the West Bank at the time, traveling under assumed names and having to escape.
In September 1967, Arab leaders met in Khartoum to define a clearer and more uncompromising stance to Israel. They issued what became known as the three no's. No peace with Israel, no negotiations with Israel, and no recognition of Israel. Chastened by the 1967 defeat, President Nasser made a political U-turn and embraced Fatah.
ومنا من كان ناصريا وأصبح قال فيش هناك حزب ناصر قلت يا سيادة الرئيس أنا ناصر.
A group of us in Fatah went to Egypt and we finally met with Nasser. I told him I was a Nasserist. I said we are a group of young men who believed in their God and country and were intent on liberating it. He said Egypt would from now on share everything with us.
Egypt began providing training and support for Fatah's guerrillas on the condition that operations not be mounted from Egyptian territory. Jordan quickly became the springboard of attack. The government in Amman could only stand by and watch. In March 1968, Palestinian guerrillas attacked a bus, killing 2 Israelis. Defense Minister Moshe Dayan vowed to teach the Palestinians a lesson. The target was the Jordanian village of Karame in the Jordan Valley, which had become a Fatah stronghold. Some 15,000 Israeli troops were mobilized and took part in the attack. The Palestinian defenders put up a stiff resistance. Jordanian army and artillery support proved crucial, inflicting heavy casualties on the invading Israelis. But not all Palestinian factions had favored a fight. Some had withdrawn from Karame on the eve of the battle, leaving only Arafat's Fatah in the field.
The Arab nationalist movement believed it was a mistake for a guerrilla force to face the enemy head-on, and therefore withdrew its fighters from Karame. But Arafat took into account the popular reaction to such a confrontation and the support the Fidaiyin would gain in its aftermath.
قلت لهم شيء. إحنا كأمة عربية.
The Jordanian chief of staff and the commander of the Iraqi forces tried to convince me to withdraw from Karama.
خلينا نصمد فيها. وخلينا نستشهد فيها.
I told them after the defeat of 1967, we took an oath to fight to the very end, and even if it meant martyrdom.
The Israeli army defeated the Palestinians at Karame. But a potent legend was born, that the Arabs would stand and fight, and that the Israelis were not invincible. Karame proved a tremendous boost to Arafat's Fatah movement. Thousands of volunteers flocked to Palestinian guerrilla camps, while Arabs across the Middle East donated funds and supplies to these fighters. 3 years after its launch, Fatah and the Palestinian armed struggle now emerged into the mainstream. By gaining autonomy from Arab states and fighting for themselves, the Palestinians now became masters of their own destiny. From now on, the way of the gun was the path forward. But those guns would soon face off with fellow Arabs.